Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Regent College. We're gathered on the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Musqueam people, and it's a delight to welcome you to the Laing Lectures for 2024. Good to see some new faces from last night and some returning faces, and a warm welcome to all of you that are joining us in the live stream as well from wherever you are. Glad to have you with us as well. So I want to say a little bit about these lectures, and I'll introduce our speaker for tonight. Just one word that because of the live stream particularly, I just need to let you know that this is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel tomorrow, and that means that by coming in, as the sign at the door suggests, you have consented to be filmed and seen on the video that will be released. And we could potentially use your image in reporting on this event or in promoting Regent College. So that's our disclaimer in terms of how that live stream works. So it is a real pleasure to talk for just a moment about the Laing Lectures. This is the 25th anniversary year of the Laing Lectures, 1999. Seems like a very long time ago. And the first lecturer was Neil Postman. You certainly would at least earn a Timbit if you were at that lecture in 1999. I know Roger Lang was. I don't know anyone else that was here. Someone else? Craig Gay, Julie Gay, you were here in 1999? They need a Timbit for sure as a reward for that. There have been many great lectures over these last years, and each year the Laing Lectures have been a highlight of the year for Regent College. The purpose is really to bring an outstanding thinker in some particular area that will bring their expertise to bear upon our thinking as Regent College of how to think faithfully, how to live faithfully as Christian people in light of the issues and concerns that they bring forward. And so the topic this year in terms of race, racism, racial reconciliation is one of those pressing issues of our culture right now, our society, and really a worldwide issue of racial division and racism. So this topic is very apropos to the series, and we have an outstanding lecturer to share with us. A couple of just technical notes before I introduce Dr. Yancey, which is afterwards, tonight's lecture, there is a book table out at the bookstore with some of his books, as well as also a table with books by other authors on topics that are of great interest to this subject matter. And one thing I wanted to mention, just to recommend, if you're looking for probably one book of Dr. Yancey's many, many books, we do have a resupplied copy as of today of his book from 2022, which is called Beyond Racial Division. And very apropos of tonight's lecture is the cover, the territory that he'll be covering tonight in the lecture relates to this book very directly. It's very readable and accessible, the sort of thing you could pass on or use in a group to discuss and so on. So that's one that I'd particularly recommend to you. So he'll be out at the book table afterwards, after tonight. Just want to politely remind you to turn off your cell phone or pager or other beeping device, please, just so as not to distract or interrupt what we're doing. And a reminder, there's no audio or video recording of tonight's lecture, please. And you can take some pictures, but not with a flash, we hope. So with all of those preliminaries accomplished, let me tell you a little bit about Dr. George Yancey. It has been a real pleasure to have him with us, really enjoyed his time with us. We had a wonderful Q&A session on campus led by Jessamine Birdsall earlier. He comes to us from Texas, although he grew up in San Diego, the place where there's not a bad weather day all year long. How about that? He comes to us from Texas, where he's professor at Baylor University in sociology and in the Institute for Studies in Religion. He's married. He has 3 boys, aged 8, 7, and 5. So he's here to get some rest, catch up on his sleep, and have a calm time with us. And it's been a delight to have him. As a sociologist, he has studied many major social phenomenon, and over a course of a distinguished career, we're focusing particularly on his work on race and racism in this lecture, but there are other topics as well. I just want to mention some of those. Religion and society generally, and a study of atheism earlier, the phenomenon of multiracialism and multiracial churches, marriage and family, particularly interracial marriage and dating, topic of academic bias and anti-Christian bias. He's written on both of those. And the big and vexed topic in the USA of political division and polarization of red states and blue states, and with that, seemingly red Christianity and blue Christianity. He's written outstandingly on those topics. So, amongst his many areas of expertise, he's dipping in tonight and sharing with us his work on race and racism under the title tonight of Why the Current Solutions Aren't Enough. So, a brief word about our format. He'll come and address us for about the next hour or so, and then we'll have a time for question and answer. So as you're listening, think about questions you'd like to ask. There's 2 microphones at the top of the stairs, and so when the time comes, you'd go up there and ask your question. There's also a chance for those of you on the live stream to email us a question, and the email address to use is questions@regent-edu. Be glad to have your questions and participation from online as well. I think we're all ready, so let's please welcome Dr. George Yancey.
You're back. Well, glad you're back. We'll see you come back tomorrow night, because tonight's going to be a hard night for some of us. Because tonight I'm going to challenge some of the solutions that probably some of y'all have to address the big question. Now, if this was my class, I would say, what was the big question? And then I get silence for 5 minutes. Then finally someone would be so, silence, and then they finally would give it, they try to answer the question, and it wouldn't be quite right, so then people start looking through their notes, and then, well, you professors know what's happening. So, but I'm not gonna do that. You're not my class, I'm not grading you, and so you don't even have to take this for a test, although I do see some of y'all taking notes, so that's good. Good. You want to come take a class with me? The big question, let me go ahead and read it verbatim so I don't mess it up. The big question is, how do we correct for the historical and contemporary racial dysfunctions in our society in a way that's fair to everyone? How do we recover from our history of racial abuse in a way that most of us can consider the efforts to be fair? That's the big question. Last night we looked at the history of racial abuse, we looked at some of the institutional racism in our society, and we looked at modern racist attitudes. How do we deal with that in a way that is fair? All right, so my argument, and as you can see, is the current solutions are not enough. They don't deal with that question. There are 2 current solutions that people put forth, and I'll just name them and then we'll go look at them. Those solutions are colorblindness and anti-racism. Now, anti-racism can, there's been other terms for it. Anti-racism is a term of art right now, and so that's the one I used. When I wrote about this in 2006, anti-racism was not the big top, it wasn't the well-known word, and there wasn't one that I knew about, so I wanted to create one of my own. So I went to my publishers, University Press, and said, hey, why don't I call it this? Whites are evil. They said, that's a little harsh. So we settled on white responsibility. But anti-racism is a better term to use at this point in time. So I want to look at these one at a time. Remind you that I am an academic, and so what I want to do is look at the academic research. I want to look at the research because I don't want this to just be my opinion on whether or not these things work or not. Because you may be saying, well, you don't want them to work because you want to champion your own solution and feel like the hero. Okay, well, maybe I do. But I want to look at what research says about this so that we can know whether it works or not. And if one of these work, that's what we should do. But what I think we're going to find is that they don't work. So first, let's look at colorblindness. Okay, so what do I mean when I say colorblindness? What are people who are advocating colorblindness, what are they looking at? Well, one of the first things about colorblindness is that those who advocate colorblindness say that we must ignore race to solve racism. What they're arguing is that the reason why we have racism is people pay attention to race. So they see someone, they see, oh, that person is Hispanic, oh, that person, they're lazy or they're whatever, and they treat them differently. If for some reason we didn't see them as Hispanic, then we wouldn't treat them differently. What if we all woke up and we were a light green? First, I would have to go Hulk smash just one time. Before I freak out, I have to do that one time. If I'm light green, I'm going to do that. But then, according to the colorblind people, that's great. You may be ugly, but it's still great. Because now we can't tell the difference racially, and race would not matter, and that is the solution to racism. Okay, another element is that people who are colorblind call out any differential treatment based on race. So they will call out the KKK member who wants to treat people differently on race. They'll also call out the Black Lives Matter activists who they interpret as treating people differently by race. Any differential treatment by race, they say is wrong, and only wrong, but contributes to the problem of racism. If we want to stop racism, we stop treating people differently by race. And often what they do is they say that the KKK member is no more problematic than the Black Lives Matter activists, because they're doing the same thing, treat people differently by race. In an ideal world, race would be like hair color. Not my hair color, of course, because I have no hair. But in an ideal world, so perhaps people like blondes, perhaps people like brunettes or redheads, that's fine. But we don't attach social significance to our hair color. It's just a way to describe us. So if you're trying to say, hey, why don't you go meet Jeff? What's Jeff? Well, Jeff is that, brunette guy, 6'2", and he's gonna, okay, and he's white, and that's all it means. It's just a description. If we treat race like hair color, then that would be our ideal world under colorblindness. This is a popular idea among whites and political conservatives that, now I'm not saying that all whites advocate colorblindness or even all political conservatives advocate colorblindness, but here's where the idea has found its popularity. What scholars have argued is that a lot of times Europeans and European Americans like this idea because what it does is it locks into place the racial advantages they have in our society. That now we'll just ignore race, and therefore the advantages they have will remain. So this is the notion of colorblindness. Now, there's a variation of colorblindness that I think is quite interesting that came out about 30 years ago. And it's a book called The Declining Significance of Race, written by William Julius Wilson, and who happens to be an African-American scholar, by the way. And so his argument is this. Oh, there he is. He argues that racism has been a big problem in the past. So he will look at much of what I looked at yesterday as far as the historical racism and says, yes, racism has been a huge problem in the past. However, today, overt racism is largely gone. As I said, there's research now saying that the worst thing you could be called that's legal is a racist. So there's a stigma, we stigmatize overt racism, and thus he argues it's largely gone. So historical racism then has created race-based economic inequalities. So Wilson would argue, okay, we've had problems. Racism was horrible in the past. Overt racism is largely gone. But what's remained is that we have these economic inequalities. So African Americans, Hispanic Americans, indigenous people, they economically are on a lower level in a society where we don't have overt racism. So that's what he's looking at. Thus, he argues that our focus should be on class-based solutions instead of race-based remedies. His argument is that since we don't have this sort of overt racism, what we have left is class-based racial differences. If we try to do racial solutions, that's not what the problem is. The problem is that people of color make less money. than European Americans. So why not have just a total class-based program to lift up all the poor, which would include poor whites, poor anybody. And by doing so, we will disproportionately lift up people who are racial minorities. So this was a very important book of its day. It is a variation of colorblindness. He's advocating that we don't use race-based policies, even as he recognizes the effects of historical racism. So I just want to point that out, that colorblindness, there can be variations within. The main focus is that we should not use race in our remedies. Eventually, what we have to do is to get away from race. All right. Now, there are times that I use colorblindness. When I'm grading my papers, if I recognize a person as an African American, I don't say, well, I'll give him a couple of points because his people have had it tough. And in my interpersonal relationships, when I meet people, I want to be colorblind to find out who they are, rather than put some sort of racial stigma or stereotype upon them. And I realized this a couple months ago when people were talking about, hey, how do you handle your interpersonal relationships? I said, well, you know what? I am colorblind in a lot of ways. However, as we're going to see, well, actually, I don't even have to see, because I showed you last night the problem of colorblindness. Despite the notion that we don't have overt racism the same way we used to, we still have racial discrepancies tied to institutional and modern forms of racism. So let's say that Wilson is correct. Let's say that we have this historical racism, and all we have left is class-based, just from what's happened historically. If our differences is only because of what's happened historically, then perhaps all we need is class-based remedies. But let's just take one look at one of the studies that we talked about. Remember the study showing that we've not had a decrease in occupational discrimination over the past 25 years. So that if a person of color applies for a job, just because of their name, if their name is Leroy, they're less likely to be called back for an interview. That's not just an historical discrepancy. That's modern forms of racial inequities. And if we do nothing, then we will continue to have people of color not called back for jobs. How are we going to close the class differences? If that's all we need to do, if that's correct, how do we close class differences if, for reasons that we haven't fully figured out, people of color don't get called back so they can get a job interview? At some point, you have to pay attention to the racial discrepancies, and you have to figure out what's happening and how you can remedy it. Colorblindness does not allow us to do that. It is if you get sick and you do nothing about it. So as I told you all last night, my wife and my youngest son were sick. And, which is why I'm doing the fist bump thing, because I don't want to risk spreading the sickness, spreading the love to you Canadians. It's strep throat. And fortunately, my wife's got strep throat before. She recognized it. So she went to the doctor, got confirmed, got the antibiotics, and she's feeling better. And, my son was, she was chasing around my youngest son and getting exhausted that way. But it's lower. Because she took a remedy to it. If we didn't do anything to say, well, it'll run its course, it may well run its course, and she may be sick for a very long time. And my youngest will be sick for a very long time. And with certain diseases, it can kill you. When people are sick, when you have a wound, you have to have a remedy. Colorblindness is saying, no, you're doing all right now. No one's cutting you right now. No one's giving you a disease right now. we'll just let things go. And that doesn't work. And the people who know it doesn't work the most are people of color, which is one of the reasons why they're so resistant to a colorblind perspective. So as far as looking at research, why it doesn't work, just look back at last night, especially when I talk about modern forms of racism and institutional racism, and what are we going to do with that? How are we going to deal with that by ignoring it? Okay. This brings us to the second potential solution, which is anti-racism. Okay, when I was working on my book, I wanted, anti-racism was the big buzzword, and so I wanted to know what was anti-racism. I read some academic articles on it, not a lot, I've read a lot more since then, but I wanted to know what the popular books were saying. So I got about 5 or 6 of the most popular books on anti-racism. I read them through and through. I looked up articles. I wanted to know what people meant when they said anti-racism. I wanted to analyze them. I wanted to find commonalities between the literature that was out there. The literature that people are reading, not some offshoot that has sold 20 books. For a period of time, the 2 most popular books in the United States in 2020 was How to Be an Anti-Racist, which was number 2, and White Fragility, which is number 1. So I started off with those 2, but then I read, so you want to talk about race, me and white supremacy, how's it go? I'm done talking to white people, or something like I read other popular books, and I found certain tenets of popular anti-racism. Now, I will tell you that since then, I've also dug deeply into the anti-racism academic literature, and a lot of tenets of popular anti-racism is found in academic anti-racism as well. There are some small differences, but it's not that important. Here are the tenets that I found on anti-racism so we can understand what this solution is. First, that racism is a natural part of our society. That for many of them, racism is Americanism. To be American is to live in a racist society. It is epidemic in our society. It's just a natural part. And I would say that they would probably say the same thing about Canadian society. Racism is multifaceted. And here's what I mean by this. We think of racism, a lot of people think of racism as personal racism. But as we saw last night, racism is also institutional. And so it's not just personal, it's just institutional, it's structural, it's in our social structures, and it's in our families, it's in our schools, it's in our criminal justice system. It's multifaceted. So getting rid of one type of racism doesn't eliminate other types of racism. That's how deeply ingrained racism is in our cultures. Thus, we need societal overhaul. The literature is calling for an overturning of our society, that we need to almost burn it down and start from scratch, if you really want to look at it that way. That's how bad racism is in our society. That we're going to have to start from scratch and totally change our society. Now, this is the one that people might find controversial. And what I always say is, fine, if you find it controversial, find me an anti-racism book that's somewhat popular that doesn't have this last one, which is the role of whites is to do what people of color want them to do. This comes across in a lot of different ways. Just one example from White Fragility, which was the most popular anti-racism book. There's a point in the book where D'Angelo says to the whites she's communicating with, she tells a story, she's communicating with whites, and she's frustrated because they're arguing or they're crying or things of this nature. So she turns to some people of color and she says, wouldn't it be wonderful if what the whites did was listen to you and then try to do better? And that was D'Angelo's way of saying, what are whites supposed to do? They're not supposed to argue, they can't cry, they can't yell. Well, what they're supposed to do is listen to people of color and try to do better. That sort of theme I found in all the anti-racism books. Some version of that, maybe not that exact way I put it, but in some version of that, I found in all anti-racism books. Purpose of whites is to do what people of color want them to do. Now, sometimes when people talk about how do we deal with racial issues in a non-colorblind way, they may say, well, all right, anti-racism. But is anti-racism multiculturalism? Are we talking about multiculturalism or are we talking about anti-racism? And so my argument is that anti-racism is not multiculturalism. In fact, I talked about multiculturalism in the 2006 book because at that point in time, multiculturalism was a very important key way some people were dealing with racism. And one thing I argue is that that has declined. Multiculturalism initially was developed by education academics. It was a way that they were trying to incorporate non-white cultures into history, into literature, into one of the ways we teach education. The idea was that if we can sort of decenter the centrality of European American culture in our education, then we create a space for everyone. It emphasized the worth and value of minority cultures. So in multiculturalism, different cultures, especially non-white cultures, we emphasize just how valuable they are, how great worth they have. One of the things multiculturalism was trying to address was notions of cultural superiority. The idea of Anglo conformity, that Europeans and European Americans, that's the primary culture that we should emulate. There was an idea that was going around that the way for people of color to succeed is to do what Europeans had done, to pull themselves up by the bootstraps, individualism. I was told, and this happened in the United States as well, that in Canada, many indigenous people were sent to, well, in the United States it was boarding schools, where they are taught to be farmers, where they were taught to be, this great individualism, which really was crushing the sort of communal nature of their culture. And I'm told similar things happened here in Canada. And so that's what multiculturalism was reacting against. It was reacting against this sort of Anglo conformity that says, hey, people of color, you act white, you sort of kind of be white, and you too can succeed in our culture. Multiculturalism started in education and then moved on to other avenues with a desire to appreciate cultures on their own terms. And so, for example, there's talk about multiculturalism policing, where, yes, obviously there's rules that are not culturally suspect. I mean, murder is going to be punished no matter what culture you're from, but to be more sensitive in your policing when you're policing different cultures, to be more aware of some of the cultural differences and to not come down hard on those differences, but to allow their cultures to breathe and allow their cultures to flourish. So multiculturalism policing, multiculturalism in economics, how we can craft economic systems that accommodate different cultures. Talking of some of the Asian cultures, Koreans, for example, had credit systems where they were much more communal, where they pool their money together and then loan it out to each business, let a business start. So the business is part of the community rather than an individual starting a business on their own. A different way of looking at things. So that was a big part of the emphasis of multiculturalism. Now, saying all that is multiculturalism is a certain ideology, it's a certain way of thinking. And that way of thinking is to try to find ways of connecting with all of these different cultures. And it's not anti-racism. Multiculturalism declined popularity as anti-racism rose up. Because think about it. Anti-racism is not about accepting different cultures. You read the anti-racism literature, there are definitely cultures that there's a hostility towards. To be fair, one could argue that the multiculturalism that developed historically never was totally accepting of more traditional European American culture. But in theory, it would have been. In theory, you don't denigrate any culture. Anti-racism, even in theory, you're allowed to challenge what is called whiteness. Whiteness is not something to be preserved. Multiculturalism has a philosophy where we preserve all cultures. We can all enjoy our cultures. That's not the case with anti-racism. And so as anti-racism began to emerge, the efforts toward multiculturalism began to decline because they conflict with one another. You see this less in the popular literature, but you do see this especially in the academic literature, where academics who are talking about anti-racism and the rise of anti-racism complain about multiculturalism. They complain that multiculturalism allows things such as whiteness to keep flourishing, and that rather than accepting that, we have to find ways of destroying it, of ending whiteness. So multiculturalism is not anti-racism. Are there similarities in certain ways? Yes. But understand that what's happened is multiculturalism, if you really pay attention, efforts toward multiculturalism has decreased over the past several years. Anti-racism has grown stronger. Okay, so that gives you some more of a clarity. I mean, colorblind is kind of more simple, hey, ignore race. Anti-racism is a little bit more complicated, but this gives you an idea of what it's about. Now, the question, is it successful? Understand that while the popularized term of anti-racism is only a few years old, a lot of the techniques they've been talking about has been done for decades. So we have research on how successful things such as diversity training, because anti-racists talk about, hey, we got to train people so they can end whiteness, so that they can live an anti-racism lifestyle. How successful has that been? How successful is it to be very proactive, to sort of go to companies and say, you need to do this, you need to do that, in order to help us end racism? How successful has that been? And so let's look at research on that. Diversity training has had little long-term effect on prejudice. What can happen is that there's a short-term bump in decreased prejudice, but then 6 months later, it's gone back to normal levels. It's kind of like sending your kid off to Bible camp. Sending your kid to Bible camp, and then the kid comes back, and the kid says, yes, ma'am, yes, sir, and the kid makes up the bed, and the kid eats the vegetables. And then 6 months later, it's, oh, ma, and the bed's, and the kid doesn't want to eat any vegetables. All the kid wants to do is eat, Pop-Tarts. That's all, So there was it's sort of like that in that you get this rush, but it doesn't maintain itself. Now, this is, believe it or not, the best possible outcome for diversity training that we know. There are some diversity training that does work, but in general, this is one of the better outcomes, because there are problems that can come with diversity programs. For example, in this research, they found that what diversity programs do is often they convince whites that they have solved the racial problems in their organizations. So you bring in this diversity training course, hey, we're gonna be diverse and da-da-da, we're gonna be happy, diverse, all this sort of stuff. And because you've brought a diversity training program into your organization, European Americans say, okay, we've had the program, problem solved. And so they just, say, why do we need any other efforts? We had diversity training, we got trained, problem solved. And a complacency can come in. The way in which we do training oftentimes feeds into this, because sometimes the training is not very deep. Most of us have had to take some of those online courses in the United States, like a Title IX type of online course about gender equality. Because I'm coaching my five-year-old in soccer, I had to take one of those courses on abuse and stuff like that. And honestly, I sleptwalked through it. We get to where those courses don't really have an impact, but I took the course. So I can think, hey, I know everything about it. It can bring complacency. Now, this was an interesting study. So Cooley et al. Want to know, what does teaching about privilege do? And so what they found out was there was, when they looked at whites, there was two groups. There was the people more conservative and people more liberal. And they surveyed them before they taught them about privilege and surveyed them afterwards. And as you might imagine, those are more liberal, were very sympathetic to African Americans, and somewhat sympathetic to whites who are poor. The conservatives were probably more sympathetic to the whites and not as much to the African Americans. After being taught about privilege, what they found is that the conservatives really didn't change their opinion at all. The progressives did. What happened was the progressives became less sympathetic to marginalized whites. Because oftentimes for the progressives, what they think is if you have privilege, why are you not succeeding? Why are you on drugs? Why are you homeless? Why are you in a bad relationship? So what they concluded was that teaching about privilege does not reduce does not increase sympathy towards the marginalized. In fact, it reduces it among progressives towards marginalized whites. But it does not increase sympathy towards marginalized people of color. It is a lesson that how we do diversity training matters. We can't just, and to be honest, a lot of what diversity training has not been tested, there's not an empirical basis to it. We can put someone up there, they have a good heart, they have ideas, they do diversity training for us, and you just don't know what you're going to get, and it can make things worse. Speaking of which, diversity programs are justified by diversity rationale. In other words, we're doing this because we want more diversity. So we're going to have these programs. What they do is that they reduce notions they reinforce notions of minority inferiority to whites. So they're saying, hey, we're going to do this diversity program so we can hire more minorities. What happens is that the whites go, okay, we're getting an affirmative action hire, which in their minds is a person of color who really didn't earn the job. What they found is if you can rationalize it by non-diversity means, say, this is good for us economically, you don't get this effect. But when we go and say, diversity is important to us, therefore we're doing this, what you're sending a signal that the people we're going to hire are not fully qualified for the position. And then this is some research that I did about a decade ago, a little bit more than that now, and it was at Christian college campuses, Protestant campuses. And what I found is that when I asked whites about anti-racism training, I found that anti-racism training, when they underwent it, actually made them less willing to deal with racism. That those who went under training came out of it less willing to deal with racism. There is other research, I don't think I put it down here, did I put it down here? Here, let's see. I can't read my notes. All right, well, that's multiculturalism training. There is other research that shows that, that diversity training can create a backlash against people of color. That the whites who go into the training actually come out more hostile to people of color than they went going into the training. And this last one does deal with multicultural training to the degree that we still use it. It can create a problem because it can lead to more acceptance of biological racial differences. It can reinforce biological racial stereotypes because we talk about differences so much. So when it comes to doing anti-racism and doing training, it has not really been very effective. I will talk tomorrow about some types of programs that have been more effective. They don't tend to be what people use, and then I'll help use that to help build my argument for a solution. I want to spend a little extra time, though, on one particular study. And this is Dobbins and Calvage, a 2016 study. It is placed in the American Sociological Review, which is the top-ranked sociological journal. So that tells you that this was not some sort of one-off that's accidentally got in there. Very interesting study. And this is not about diversity training per se, but it's about efforts of companies to hire people of color as managers, not as frontline workers, not as just employees who are grunt workers, people who manage them. So what they did, and by the way, if you want to look this up yourself, just punch in why diversity programs fail, and there's an article that comes up that explains their program. They studied 829 mid-sized and large US firms. All right? They documented efforts to increase minority representation among managers. So we did these firms, and they found out, okay, what are you doing to try to increase representation among managers? And then they went away and came back 5 years later. And they want to see, all right, did what you do, did it result in more managers? 5 years is enough time that we should see a few more. They may not all be CEOs, but we should see a few more. And what they found is that certain efforts, that companies did this, came back 5 years later, they actually had fewer, not the same, fewer minority managers. So tonight I'm going to tell you what doesn't work, and tomorrow I'll tell you what did work. There's some things that companies did that actually was correlated with more managers. But tonight, tonight's going to be the downer. If you want to find out what does work, you have to come back tomorrow. So yeah, I'm guaranteed that we're going to have some people here tomorrow. All right, so, but what does not work? And this had to be up here, right? Mandatory diversity programs. When you mandated that people had to go to diversity training, 5 years later, those companies had fewer minority managers. By the way, just as a little aside, they also looked at women. Not looking at women like checking them out. I mean, looked at women as far as managers and stuff like that. Look at women. I know that sounds bad. That's majority. That should be mandatory. Okay, sorry, professors goofed up. Mandatory diversity programs does not work. Job testing. Now, what job testing is companies will be told, look, the way you're hiring people is that you're going out and getting your friends who are white, and they're becoming managers. So now everyone has to take a test to get a job. And that's going to assure that people of color has a chance to get a job. And the companies that did that 5 years later have fewer minority managers. And you may be thinking, how could this be? They can't hire their friends, they have to go through a job. Well, what happened, I think this is instructive, because they actually asked some people what happened. What happened was some of the managers, when told that they had to do this job testing, resented it. So they hired their friends anyways. And the only people who took tests were the people of color who were applying for the job. So the attempt to enforce job testing actually backfired. And as a result, there's fewer managers of color. Grievance systems. So some companies will say, well, we're going to put in a grievance system. So when people of color come, if they complain, we'll have a system to address their complaints, and we can create a more hospitable environment for them. We'll have higher retention. And yet 5 years later, those companies have fewer managers of color. Now, the point I want to make is this. These techniques, what they have in common was that they were efforts to go in and mandate that people had to change in order to address this problem. And as the end result, there are fewer managers of color, which leads us to this conclusion. Some of these things people were thinking of, yeah, man, let's have a grievance system. Or yeah, let's make those white people go and have diversity training. And that may make you feel good. But 5 years later, you have fewer managers of color. So you have to ask the question, do you want to feel good or do good? Because these programs are not working. At least it's not correlated to work. So, when we look at this, I want to pull both the anti-racism and colorblindness together. When we look at this, at least as it concerns what I see in the United States, there's this cycle of racial conflict. And it works something like this. You'll have what we would call equilibrium, where things are in a steady state, things are fairly normal. Is there racial tension? Yes, but it's not unusual. And then you have a racial incident. Some racial incident will happen. And then you'll get the protests. The anti-racists are protesting. The protests will come. But then you get the counter-protests. The colorblind people will now counter-protest. And then we go back to equilibrium, waiting for all to happen again. To put it into real events, 2020, we had the first couple of months, it's hard to say we're at equilibrium because we were all shuttered from COVID, but racially it was kind of equilibrium. Then you had Ahmaud Arbery, you had George Floyd, you had the racial incidents. Then you had the protests. You had protests not just across the United States. Believe it or not, we in the United States actually do pay attention to other countries too. There was protests in Canada, there was protests in England, there was protests in Australia. It was worldwide protests against this. And then 2001 came by, and what was happening in 2001? When the protests had died down, the counter-protests happened. And the way this manifested itself was you had these school boards where you had these people come in and say, stop CRT. I actually was a Southern Baptist at the time, and I went to a national conference. I think it was in Alabama. I didn't want to go, my pastor said I should. Alabama's not like, yeah. And then the next year, I know I'm complaining right now, next year it was in Disneyland and I didn't go. That's just my luck. And when I was out there was all these people wearing these buttons say, stop CRT, because they're complaining about CRT being taught in Baptist seminaries. You had this across the country counter-protest. You had people organizing to stop CRT, in a sense, in their minds, because CRT was really a placeholder for the racial policies they didn't like, including anti-racism. His big counter-protest pushed back. And today I would say we're at equilibrium, because what happened is that there's been sort of, the companies that were 2020 say, yes, we're an anti-racism company. They're saying, well, maybe not. And churches that were like, we got to do something about anti-racism, and now it's like, well, things are, well, why rock the boat? We have other issues to be concerned about. And what we're waiting for is the next racial incident so we can start with the protest, counter-protest cycle again. So what's happening is that these two ideas are feeding off each other. There's a way where they kind of need each other. The anti-racists need the colorblindness because that's their enemy that they can sort of, gin up action against. And the colorblindness need the anti-racists. And this cycle keeps going on, and it's been on in my life. It got on with the Rodney King beatings. It happened with Trayvon Martin. This has been going on and on and on. And my prediction is it's going to keep going on and on unless we do something to break it. This cycle does not break it on its own. It's not that if we hold back and we're patient, eventually it'll just run out of steam, and then we'll just be in equilibrium, and we'll just love each other, and everything will be great. That would sound fantastic to me, but that's not the way it's going to happen. We have to do something to break this cycle where it keeps going on. And we can't break it. And you may come in here and you may say, I kind of think colorblindness is the best way. Or you may come in here and say, well, I like anti-racism. But I'm telling you, the way this is working, you can't break it by leaning into anti-racism or colorblindness. Because for them, the way the cycle is broken is they win. The people colorblindness, they win, and that's how the cycle gets broken. The anti-racism, they win, that's how the cycle gets broken. So they're going to keep fighting each other. Because at this point in time, both sides are strong enough to keep on fighting. So, these solutions will not work. As we look at them, I know you're thinking, wow, they have different solutions for the colorblindness. The solution to the big question is ignore race, and that's how you create fairness. We ignore race, we just treat each other right now. The anti-racist is we got to challenge whiteness and challenge current system, and that's how you create fairness. It seems like they have different solutions, but there actually is a commonality between the two. I want to touch on that in the last few minutes here, because I think in that commonality, we're going to see why they're failing and also lay the seeds for discussing a better way tomorrow. So to understand this commonality, I want to discuss a concept called human perfectibility. All right, so I assume that this is something that you all probably have heard in seminary. This is something that a concept that I did not learn about until I went to graduate school. And it was a fascinating concept for me, and it really opened my eyes to a lot of things. During the Enlightenment movement, one of the things that was being resisted was tradition, the church, all these sort of things. And the idea was that superstition and faith was in the way, that humans are capable of creating perfectibility. That we humans, if we got out of the way of our predestination and our fatalism and use the abilities we have, we could create perfectibility. So, we first need to educate people. That people will become better with education. If we find the right way to educate folks and teach them the right way, then they will be able to find enlightenment, they'll be able to find self-actualization, and to move away from the sort of superstition of the church that the Enlightenment thinkers were trying to move us away from. That we would look at science, and that science was going to be our salvation in a sense. Not our salvation as far as like a God, but through science will create perfectibility. This perfectibility, by the way, is not just in the individuals. This perfectibility is that we will then create a society that is perfectible. So this was a big notion in there. The notion that we're rational creatures, rationality, science. And as rational creatures, we can become convinced to become better. Logic. And the argument was that the church was anti-science, anti-logic. It was superstition. And so part in the social struggle against the traditional order, against the Catholic Church or the Church of England, that they get in the way because they get in the way of science and logic and rationality. Now, just a little aside here. When I was in grad school, the notion of humans being rational and that we can count rationality was kind of interesting. But then again, I didn't have kids. So since having kids, I'm like, did none of these people have kids? If not, were they smoking something, thinking that we can become rational? So anyways, it's that there's many stories that can come out of that. But I'm just saying that as a fatherless person at that time, there was a way in which I thought, well, that might be true. Now I just know it's Buckus. All right, so, and in all honesty, this perfectibility is a key difference between us as Christians and secular ideologies. And I think it's a difference that is not emphasized enough because the implications of this is massive. Now, I'm going to just look at it as far as racial issues. I've thought about it in other issues as well, but when you think of people, and I said this in the podcast, and so I think it's worth repeating. For those who are engaged in this sort of thinking, humans have great worth, and they are the pinnacle of evolution. And that's all there is. Christians have a version of that, but as we're going to talk about tomorrow, Christians add something to that, which I think is more truthful. And I think that what those who are humanists miss is that additional element. So that is a really key difference between Christians and those who are humanists or secularists, and I may even dive further into that tomorrow. All right, so how does this deal with race? And once again, there's other implications to this, and and it's worth looking into. Well, if what you hear from both camps, and here's where they really are the same. Even though they have totally different ideas, and you put in the same room, they'll give them boxing gloves, and they'll try to take each other out. All that sort of is true. But here's where they really are the same. If our insight, be it colorblindness or anti-racism, is adopted, then we can move towards the end of racial alienation. So the solution for either one of them is, hey, look, we have figured it out. We have the path to perfectability. Follow us on this path and we'll end racial alienation. For some people, it's easier to see with the anti-racism because they're basically saying ending whiteness. Help us to end whiteness. Help us to do this and we'll take us on this path. But this is just as true for those who are advocating colorblindness. Why is it that whenever they encounter someone who challenges the colorblindness, they revert to calling them woke? Because they're trying to put pressure on them to adopt colorblindness over anything else. And it's the same reason why some of the anti-racists, when they find resistance, they say, well, that either you're racist if you're white, or you're white adjacent if you're not white. It's the same sort of pressure. And to illustrate that, as far as from the colorblind perspective, so a couple of years ago, when my oldest was about, I think it was about 5, and I was considering, I need to talk to him about certain things. I was thinking about the birds and the bees talk. But I was also thinking about the talk on how to talk to him about what it means to be a black man, a good black man in this country, dealing with law enforcement, dealing with the fact that some people may not like the fact that he's African American. How do I talk to him about that? And even though I'm a race scholar, that's the first time in my life I had a 5-year-old son I was responsible for. I didn't have that experience. And there's a ton of books on the birds and the bees, but no books that I really like on racial issues. And so I decided to seek out wisdom and knowledge. So I went to that place where you could find wisdom and knowledge. I went to social media. I went to Facebook. So I put a Facebook post out there, and I said, hey, if you're raising kids of color, how do you all talk to them about what it means to be a person of color? How do you approach that subject? How do you talk to them about possibly encounters with the police? What does that look like? Because I was legitimately trying to figure that out. And so some people responded back, and they actually did have kids of color. But I also got several responses from European Americans who said, well, why are you even bringing this up? Why are you worried about raising a good black Christian man? Raise a good Christian man. That's all you have to worry about. You don't have to get into this racial issues. That's part of the problem. You always want to talk about race. What they're essentially saying to me is that you, Mr. African American, should not raise your kid the way that you see fit. I have a better way of doing it. Be colorblind. So make no mistake about it. Both sides are basically saying, do what we tell you to do and we'll have racial harmony, because we have the seeds to perfectability. And even though many of the people who do colorblindness, they're considered Christians, and you say, well, you're following Enlightenment tradition, they go, no, we debunk that. They're essentially doing that. They're saying, we've figured it out. You need to do what we tell you to do, and things will be good. That does not work. A solution towards dealing with racism cannot be that we or people like me have all figured out, and now it's our job to tell everyone else what to do. And the research has shown that does not work. The research has shown that for colorblindness, it does not allow to address these wounds, this sickness, this illness. And when it comes to anti-racism, these efforts have by and large failed. And the research is pretty clear on that. They have failed. So we have to ask our question, what can work and how can we go better? And fortunately, when we look at what does work, the theology and the science matches. And I believe that truth is truth, and that good theology and good science will match. And when they don't, either you have bad theology, bad science, and sometimes both. Tomorrow, I'm going to try to match good theology, good science and take us in what I think is a better direction. Okay, ready for questions.
Thank you very much, George. That's great. I'm going to suggest that you all stand up for 60 seconds and shake your limbs and get ready to ask your questions. And then in 60 seconds, we'll sit down again. I don't see nearly enough shaking of limbs right now. More limbs, go, go, go. Good, 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 good. I'm leading an exercise class as well here. Okay. For those of you online, you can shake limbs if you wish, but here in the room, you're under pressure to do that. Okay, we will resume with your questions. If you have questions, come on up to the microphones. Lots of things for us to chew on here tonight. Thanks very much. Is that you, Amelia? Yes. Hey, yeah. Your question.
Hi, Dr. Yancey. Thank you so much for being here with us. I was really curious by the point where you talked about anti-racism and multiculturalism and how they're not the same thing. And I was curious if you could say more specifically about the concept of whiteness as opposed to like specific ethnic European identities. Because I think I was taught that like whiteness is kind of a way of, like within that we are not acknowledging our ethnic identities, like for a white person like myself. So I'm curious about what's productive about multiculturalism. Well, I guess I was intrigued by the idea also that multiculturalism wasn't really doing a good job of upholding like, or recognizing white cultures. But within that, I was curious about, just distinguishing between like whiteness and like ethnic European cultures and like, is it productive to talk about one over the other?
Okay, so yeah, so the topic of whiteness, which is I think what you're leaning into, and if I'm off on that, you can follow up. But the topic of whiteness is an interesting one, and what whiteness is probably depends on which anti-racist you're reading. You know, I think that some of them define it a little bit differently. A general definition would be things connected to the majority group culture that hold back people of color. And the way some of them interpret that is almost anything connected to the majority group culture. And so you may have heard that, that there was some sort of plaque or sign at a museum in Washington, D.C. about what is whiteness, and they had things such as being on time and rationality and stuff like that. And some people, including myself, who I tend to be on time and I like to think of myself as a rational person, said, well, you know, are you saying that us black people are dumb and we're always late? And so there's a backlash to that. So it's hard for me to say that these are the qualities that are whiteness, because that's going to vary from person to person. But I think it's a generalized notion, you know, if I'm trying to be as fair as possible, it's a generalized notion of elements within the majority group culture that might hold back for people of color. A better example than what was on that plaque, one could argue, is individualism. That individualism, the notion that individuals earn what they get through their own efforts, you know, positively or negatively, that in a society where European Americans have historically gained advantages, that tends to lock those advantages in, because it sort of implies, well, these white people are rich because they worked harder than these people of color. So that's probably a better, you know, and if the talk about whiteness was limited to, you know, a few categories like that, I think it would be less controversial. But because almost anything people point out as whiteness becomes whiteness, it becomes more amorphous in how people discuss it. So I, you know, hope that answers your question. If not, feel free to follow up. All right, sure.
Thanks, that's great. Another question up here from this side.
A question I have is, so within black communities, or is there racism there between Jamaicans or maybe you're not as dark as another group, and so the one group is ostracizing you. I know within white communities, if you happen to be a German ethnic group, they may be against the Italian ethnic group, who's against the Ukrainian ethnic group, who is against the Russian ethnic group. So how do you deal with those issues?
Okay, so you kind of asked about two related but different things. So concerning people of color, racism within, there is a concept known as the color complex, and there's a book by that term, and it focuses a lot on African American communities, but not exclusively. They find this also in Hispanic communities and to some extent Asian American communities. And the way the color complex looks is that historically lighter-skinned blacks had either easier paths, and so they begin to discriminate against darker-skinned blacks. And in fact, the wage differences between whites and blacks is 70%, and between light-skinned and dark-skinned blacks is 70%. So this almost replicated some of the racism they saw outside the community, in their own community. And just to illustrate just how strict this was, there was something known as the paper bag test. Has anyone heard the paper bag test? Okay, I see one hand, one head shaking. If you're a student, I'll make you say what it is, but you're not, so anyways. The paper bag test is, and now understand, this is a test done by blacks to blacks. So if you're going to a light-skinned club or church or social organization, and you're an African American, in order to show that you could get into it, you had to put your hand against the paper bag. If your hand was darker than the paper bag, you couldn't get in. Only blacks whose skin color was lighter than the paper bag were allowed into those organizations. That's what blacks were doing to themselves in their own communities. They were sort of replicating some of the racist values that they had seen outside and to bring into their own community. The question on ethnicities, you're correct, and maybe in Canada it's more true than in the United States. You're correct that historically those sort of ethnic conflicts was very viable. A lot of people don't know that German ethnic Americans in, say, the early 1800s were often treated as if they were not white. They were thought of as, many times they only spoke German, and they thought of, hey, come learn English, and they were thought of as aloof and that sort of thing. And we know that about the ethnic treatment of the Italian Americans and the Irish Americans. That's well known. Irish need not apply signs. They were a real thing. That's less so in the United States unless you're a first-generation ethnic, and sometimes you may be seen as kind of funny. But usually they're second, third generation. They are seen in the United States as being white. Now, Canada is more, one thing I'm observing being in Canada, and maybe it's because I'm near a campus and maybe if I went out, it wouldn't be this way, but I hear a lot of accents. And not just from people who are darker, I'm hearing the accents from people who are white, And so Canada may be more of an immigrant-based country than the United States. And if that's the case, it may be, that type of differentiation, and maybe some of the white ethnics will come up to me and says, yes, we run into this in Canada. That sort of ethnic hostility might be more viable in Canada than it is in the United States. It's not as viable in the United States as it used to be. But yes, back in the day, the white ethnic groups often did not like each other, especially if you're a white ethnic group from the south or the eastern part of Europe.
Great, thank you very much. Just a reminder to those of you who are joining us on the live stream, you can send in questions online, and you do that at questions@regent-college.edu. Up to this side.
Yes, this is a question coming from our online audience. What is the alternative to color blindness when it comes to hiring, spending money, and voting? So in the workplace, we are expected or hoping to be colorblind when hiring staff, and in our personal lives, we go to a dentist or we have our car service, and then when we vote, we vote for specific elected officials. And what would be the alternative to colorblindness in those situations?
Well, what I would say is that in our interpersonal situations, I am colorblind. So I'm not advocating that when it comes to choosing a dentist or who I'm going to vote for, that we have to be color conscious. I think the color consciousness comes when we're trying to deal with the institutions and structures and how we're gonna address them. So I'm trying to think of the things you asked about. I don't know if any of them really dealt with that. So I would say, well, be colorblind in those situations. You know, when I was single, I was colorblind when I was dating. You know, I didn't, you know, it's not, oh, I'm only gonna date this sort of race. And I think that a lot of people who even say they're anti-racist are colorblind in those ways. So I think in interpersonal relationships, colorblindness is probably the way that most of us go, and it's good. I'm also anti-racist in some things too, by the way. When anti-racism is useful for trying to find our problems, not as useful for finding solutions. But as far as recognizing problems, anti-racism is an important tool. So even though I'm critiquing these, I'm not saying that we never use these tools.
Can I just push back a little bit?
Sure.
So just in terms of you're talking about at an interpersonal level, one of the things that you've tried to do in lots of circumstances is be colorblind.
Yeah.
So let me just push back by saying, well, I mean, how can I see you and really appreciate you and enter into a relationship with you if I don't see that you're a black man,
yeah,
and that you would have a different experience of the world than my experience as a
sure,
white man? How am I not just in a sense
yeah,
diminishing you?
That's very fair. So
yeah.
yeah, I'm not saying that you don't see race.
Yeah.
I'm saying that when I first come across someone, I'm going to let them reveal themselves to me. I'm not going to presuppose that you can't play basketball because you're white. You know, I'm not.
That's
gonna,
probably true, but yeah,
maybe true. The odds are against you, but
right. The odds are against me. So
but
true.
I'm not going to presuppose that. Now, you're right, and I'm glad you brought this up because it is not helpful to say I don't see race. It is helpful. You know, I think it's fair to say, you know, when I meet someone, I'm not going to make a judgment on them based on their race.
Yep.
You know, because here's the thing. Yes, I'm an African American. And being black has impacted me, but you don't know how it's impacted me.
Right.
So you can't assume that, you know, you can't assume that I'm into hip hop or anything like that. He's black, isn't into hip hop, you know.
Right.
Not really. I'm also kind of old, you know. You know, I'm sort of done with that era of my music. So there's other things about me to discover, and being black is part of that. And so that's fair. But what I'm saying is I'm not going to like judge someone. Yeah. I'm going to let someone reveal themselves. If I meet you and you have a great hook shot, say, okay, you know, he's one of the few. You know, so I think that's the way to think about it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So avoiding a kind of prejudice in a sense, or
right,
just
in
jumping
a sense,
to assumptions
well, like
about
grading
your life.
papers. I clearly have to be colorblind when I grade papers.
Right.
You know, that would be unfair, not just to the student I'm grading, but to the other students if I was not. So there are times where I am colorblind. I'm just saying that, right, there are times, and when it comes to interacting with people, trying to give people the benefit of the doubt. But you know, yeah, the race does come into impact, and that factors in as I learn more about them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. Let's go up here to this Mike.
Hi, I'm just continuing on that pushback. Wondering, like from my reading, again, my limited reading, that our brains actually do see more race than we think. So that we do have an unconscious bias no matter what. So that ability to be colorblind is actually something that our brains already do for us unconsciously. Is that right? So that ability to do relationship colorblindly isn't actually an option for us.
I think we can say, I'm going to allow you to present yourself to me, and there is a tendency to stereotype as a shortcut. For example, I can't get to know all white women, so I may have certain shortcuts, and if I just meet you for 10 seconds and off, no big deal. But if I want to develop some sort of friendship with you, and I stick by that stereotype, then I do not allow you to reveal who you truly are. I've put you in some sort of, you know, container. So there is a heuristic where we do stereotype, and there is a use to it if we're only going to be with someone for 20 seconds, and that evaluation doesn't matter, so we don't have to spend all of our time figuring out who each individual is. But when we are interacting with someone that we want to have something that's more than just a brief acquaintance, then we do have to, and I think we can break that to discover who that person is. So that may be what you've heard about, yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Other questions? Here comes another one from the online,
Online.
cyber world.
Yes, and I'm abbreviating this, so I'm paraphrasing. And this is someone who is also pushing back a little bit against the portrayal of the anti-racism theory here. And in their experience, which looks like it's been extensive, is that anti-racism is not about white people being evil or white people needing to feel guilty for being white, but that the challenge and encouragement is rather that white people learn to understand their privilege and then to leverage that privilege on behalf of black and brown people. So it's about understanding and leveraging privilege. And so the question is, could you speak to this and also to how you understand what white privilege is and how it can be leveraged to work towards healing this racial wound in our world?
All right, so I never said that all anti-racists say that whites are all guilty. In fact, what I said was, and this person actually illustrated what I said, the role of whites is to do what people of color want them to do. And this person just said what whites are supposed to do. So in a sense, this person just showed what the mindset of anti-racism. The whites are supposed to acknowledge their privilege and leverage it for people of color. Now, I'm not saying whites shouldn't do that. I'm saying if that's your starting point, then whites are not allowed to do anything else. And the problems begin to emerge out of that. And the research shows that efforts to sort of enforce that is not working. So, and let me be clear on this. I do think there are responsibilities that go across racial groups, that all racial groups have responsibilities in the solution. The responsibilities are not going to be exactly the same. There are some that are going to be and some that are not. And I think ultimate solutions, because of our history of racial abuse, are going to wind up with differential roles for whites and people of color. But the way you get there is very important. If you get there by saying, whites, here's what you do. If you don't do this, you're an awful person. You're not helping in whiteness. You're going to get that backlash. If you get there with what I discussed tomorrow as a way where we've negotiated out what we're doing, then you bring people on board. So I think that the way that person described it is not what I argued. And in fact, the person reinforced my argument is that what the person seems to say is, here's what I want white people to do. And that's the solution.
I've got a question. If you don't, I'll ask one and then we'll go to this mic over here. I love what you've raised here toward the end, and it's still on the screen, about perfectability. Yeah. And that both sort of sides, if you want to say that, the two that you've been looking at tonight, in a sense, have that in common, a belief in individual and social perfectibility through their pathways, right? Have you ever had the experience in your extensive discussions around these things of really challenging that assumption? And what's been the response if you challenge that assumption? If you say, hey, it seems like you're assuming something that might not actually be realistic here. What's been your experience in engaging this aspect?
I don't know if I've challenged it as directly as, you're engaging in perfectibility. Yeah. When I've given this talks, I've presented perfectability. And I don't know if people have come up and says, well, that's not what I'm doing per se. So I've not directly challenged it directly. I have encountered people from the colorblindness camp and the anti-racism camp who say that I'm wrong, no, our way is the correct way. In a sense, they're doing that, they just are not naming it that. Mm-hmm. And then, I try to point out that this is not an approach that's going to be very effective. But yeah, people usually, I present it, but people usually don't want to go to that sort of abstract level of discussing it. So.
Yeah, okay. It's just a very interesting point. Yeah, let's go up here, Richard.
Thanks, Dr. Yancey, for your talk and all that you've shared with us. A lot of this discussion has brought to my mind sort of the first place where I started to learn about race, especially in the US. I was raised in Hong Kong, so it was like quite a foreign discussion to me. But I guess I first learned about racial dynamics, especially in the US, through the civil rights movement, through studying that movement. And I guess a lot of this, what you bring up here, some of it reminds me of that discussion and reminds me of that, some of the same dynamics going on during that period. So I'm just curious, for you, do you feel like there's any relationship between what happened in the civil rights movement and anti-racism? Like, was it in a sense an early form of anti-racism? Just curious how the civil rights movement, how that maps onto the civil rights movement.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. There are some academic anti-racists who would say that civil rights was an earlier form of anti-racism. And so, so you have to have that out there, because their idea of anti-racism is anything that challenges the racist system of the day. That doesn't mean that it contains all the elements that I previously talked about. It may not have had the elements of whites have to do what people of color want them to do, but as a resistance to racism, that is a type of anti-racism. Is it a precursor to the anti-racism of today? In one sense, it is. In another sense, I don't think it had to lead to what we have today. I think that there are off-ramps to it that could have been more productive in certain ways. I think about King, and I wonder if King had survived, whether he would have eventually guided to a path that was not as that didn't make the sort of demands that we see from anti-racism today that have not been productive. Maybe he would have, maybe he wouldn't have. So I don't think it had to lead to what we have today, but clearly it was a predecessor. It is, as far as resistance of racism, it did illustrate that element of anti-racism, and it tackled a racism that people more clearly sought as prevalent throughout the whole society. Whereas when you talk about that today, some people will say, no, it's not. There's a few races out there, and there's a few people out there that are racist, and that's our own problem. But back then, there's no way you could say that. You had Jim Crow, you had all this, this vicious type of racism that no one can miss. So I think that there are some. It is fair to make some argument that it was a predecessor. Yes.
Intrigued by, you had mentioned that both of these approaches, both of them are failing and neither is succeeding. And just during the civil rights movement, like one of the interesting dynamics that came up was that one of the critiques, I think, against King was that the movement was changing laws, but not people's hearts.
Yeah.
And in that sense, it was succeeding on one level and failing on another level. And I think King's response was that, hey, it's a good thing that the law has changed, that I cannot be lynched or murdered in a cold-blooded way, the way that may have been legal before, or essentially legal before. So I'm just wondering when you say that both of these approaches have failed, in what respect have they failed? Just at the interpersonal level, or has there been success at policy, just things like that? Just curious.
I would actually disagree. I think the laws were changed because hearts were changed. Because King's philosophy of nonviolence was not to force people. King's philosophy of nonviolence was to illustrate the horror of racism so people would want to change. When you read King's writings, he wrote about the souls of whites. That he actually had concern for the souls of whites because he thought racism was darkening their soul. So he had to illustrate the ugliness of racism and did that through nonviolent protests. So the laws were changed, yes, but I think hearts were changed. I think that anti-racism fails today because we live in a different time. The sort of racism King was up against, the sort of protest and the sort of going out, that was to some degree necessary because it was so obvious. If you do that today, what people are going to say is that I don't see the racism. So we have to find a way to help people to see the problems. Because if they don't see the problems, then they're not going to back the solutions or any solutions. That was not an issue back in the 60s and 70s. The problems were self-evident. And the problems were not evident. Having dogs sicked on kids illustrate the problems really fast. So that was a different methodology for a different time. And that doesn't mean it's going to work. It's like the generals were fighting the same war. The same strategy that worked before doesn't necessarily work right now. And today, it's not working. Today, you get the counter-protests, and then you get the backlash. So we got to think of new ways for today.
We'll take one more question over here, but I say one of King's also strategies was to say collectively, we in the black community have economic power, so we're going to boycott.
Yeah.
Right. That strategy doesn't seem to be enacted very much these days. What's your read on that?
Yeah, boycotts by any group is kind of hard because usually there's other groups that will go, oh, you're boycotting them, well, we're going to go buy it instead. So boycotts are a little bit hard. There are some boycotts that seem to be successful. I don't know as an enduring strategy because it really does not bring people to a place where they can be persuaded. It's about using power, and it has the limitations of using power. And so I'll go into that tomorrow.
Yeah, great. We look forward to that.
Going in tomorrow, so come back.
Yeah, just come on back. One last question from up here before we dismiss for the night. Thanks.
You talked about how in the study with all the different firms in the U.S., they found that mandatory,
diversity training.
Yeah, mandatory diversity training and job testing didn't work, as well as the grievance systems. Could you unpack the grievance systems a little bit more? Like, what was it about those systems that didn't work?
Yeah. So the grievance systems, of course, there are different systems for different companies. Basically, if there was a grievance, you could, a person of color could go, and the system would look into it and presumably be inclined to address the issue. Well, why wouldn't that work? Why wouldn't that create an atmosphere? Well, think about it for a second. So one of the things about grievance systems is if people don't feel that they're justified, they may be forced to comply, but they can also create an atmosphere that is unwelcoming. So you could win your grievance and still have a hostile environment because people now start doing things that they can't be written up for, but still create a hostile environment. One way to illustrate this, and another problem is that the grievance systems create an incentive for people to want to include people of color in there. One of the dynamics I see people talking about, and this is on women, is that maybe we don't want to hire women because we hire women, then they're going to complain about sexual harassment, and then we're going to have a problem. And so what I think has happened is that sometimes women are less likely to be hired because of this sort of fear. And you say that's not fair, but people do what people do. And people do grievance systems what people do. And so the grievance system did not create an atmosphere that was conducive to retaining people of color or to incentivize people to hire people of color. And for that reason, companies that use grievance systems were less likely to hire more people of color, in fact, had fewer people of color 5 years later. So these are the problems. We see a problem, we see a solution, this is an obvious solution, we're going to do this, but there are second and third order effects from that solution that we don't always consider.
Thanks, that's a great question. Well, what a wonderful evening. Let's thank Dr. Yancey for this evening to go with him. And as I said, in just a minute, I will escort him up to the bookstore where there's a book table. Come buy a book. Authors love to sign books. That's a hint. And join us tomorrow night at the same time, right here. The topic is the theology and sociology of conversation. So over against the problem and non-solution, you'll get more of his path forward. So please join us tomorrow night. Thanks for being here. Have a good evening.